Either of you ladies like water bottles?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
I gotcha. Hello everybody, welcome to another camera class. We'll get started in a little bit here. Today is Camera Intermediate. Let me get the presentation pulled up for us. Alright, and we'll get going in just a second here.
Grassy.
Are those, have you opened these?
Not yet.
Is that room temperature?
No, I just pulled these out a little bit ago. I think they're still cold. Get a feel.
Yeah, they're the same.
I usually, because I always burn through them after a little bit. My throat starts to get a little tired. Alright, so intermediate cameras, everybody, today. So the main goal for this class is we're moving away from just sticking to automatic for our settings. We want to learn more about how the command dial works in a little more of an intimate way and kind of just learn how to use the camera from more of either a full manual perspective or maybe from a perspective of just controlling the aperture or the shutter or some of those settings. So that's kind of the main goal today. We also talk about lenses, and then we'll look at photo examples and kind of break down what we're seeing in there. So I guess from last week, we really talked about graduating away from the iPhone or from your Samsung device or Google device, moving into something a little bit more advanced and just trying to get a better feel for how that all works. But now we want to get more advanced with a point-and-shoot DSLR mirrorless, and why do we want to? And the reason is because we want to get better photos. We either want something that has better colors or contrast or better proportions, less distortion, something that just looks clean. We want a good photo overall. So the reason we get more advanced with it is to get more out of our photo. So the first thing I like to talk about in this is kind of the difference between those things. So you have something like a snapshot versus a photograph, and what's the difference between this? If anyone has been to the store who's online, or if you've just been in general and seen pictures, we have two escalators in our atrium section. One takes you up to the mattress department, and we have this really cool mural or ceiling piece of the Chicago skyline. It's nice and blue with the sky in the background too. This was a picture I took with my cell phone, just a quick shot. This is something that you probably would text to your friend and say, hey, I'm here, meet me at such and such a location. Moving into that, though, if we want to make it something a little bit more professional, we can take a photograph of it. And the way that we would do something like this is to control things like our aperture, our shutter, our metering, our ISO. Things like that will help get more contrast, we'll get better symmetry, it'll get better focus out of the camera, and overall it'll make a better photo. So again, you go from something that you took real quick with your phone and something that you set your camera up, worked on making sure that your lighting was where it needed to be, and played with a couple of the dials that are on the camera to get something a little bit more professional or nicer. Step one, and I know I talked about it in the first class, is learn your camera. There are so many different models out there, and this is what this picture is supposed to kind of illustrate. From here, there's even newer models that have come out. I made this slide about a year ago at this point, and now at this point, Sony has, I think, an extra 4 or 5 cameras on that list. Canon has an extra 2 or 3, and Nikon has about 4 or 5 more cameras added onto that list. So there's new cameras that come out every year. There's new technology that's constantly evolving. It's hard to stay on top of all of that. Whatever camera you decide to go with or you buy, just make sure you learn it, the ins and out of it. Make sure you understand where the buttons are, how to operate the menu system. In the long run of things, even if you have questions on how to do stuff, it's a lot easier to find those in the future if you just have that base understanding of where everything on your camera is. So we talk more about editing in the third class, so next week for advanced cameras. But for those of you who want to start getting into it, some of the things I recommend would be Photoshop, Lightroom. Those two are by Adobe. They're fantastic products. Photoshop is more of the I want to change everything in my photo kind of realm. If there are things you don't like and you want to crop them out, or you want to color match, or you want to, let's say, use Adobe's new AI processor, that's what Photoshop is amazing for. Lightroom, on the other hand, is similar if you ever did like, what am I thinking of here? Film photography, and you sat in a dark room and you do dodging and burning over a lamp. Those sorts of things where you're changing saturation, hue, sharpness on an image, you're spot checking. Those are more things that you can do with Lightroom. However, you can do those in Photoshop as well. Photoshop, I would just say, has more going on than Lightroom does.
Does it have AI? I think you said.
I know Photoshop does. The Lightroom, I don't believe so. I think that is just the AI Photoshop on, Photoshop and has AI in there. The other ones to look at too, so the one thing with Adobe that nobody is a big fan of is that you pay monthly for their services. They used to do it years ago where you were able to just buy it outright with one flat price, and now they make you pay anywhere between $15 or $10 a month all the way up to about $60 a month. So for those that don't want to do that, Capture One Pro and Corel Paint Shop Pro are both amazing softwares. I've played with Capture One Pro myself, and then I've done research on Corel Paint Shop Pro. Very similar to what Photoshop and Lightroom are offering, just a little bit different on their menu layout and how they do their system. But same idea, if you find brushes or texture packs or things that you like, you want to move them in like you could with Photoshop, you can do the same thing with Capture One Pro or Corel. So the mode dial, that's going to be again the main topic of what we're really looking at today. The mode dial is our gear shifter, like our car. It controls everything that we're doing on the camera and sets exactly what we're going to be doing next. So when we look at something like this, there's multiple different dials out there. Everyone's camera looks slightly different. Last week, and for most beginner photographers, I always recommend staying on auto. It'll either be auto, it'll be written on there with a camera symbol underneath. It might be a green symbol of some sort, like the square on the Nikon camera, or it could just say auto written in white. It doesn't have to have any green on there, but typically they call it out with the most bright colors or in a way where you know that that's what's going to drive your camera and allow you to kind of just focus on taking the photo rather than having to control the settings or manipulate anything. The next steps within that, you're looking at automatic. That's kind of what we worked on last week. Program auto is very similar, but things like your, let's say, bracketing areas for your focus, or things like your ISO, or other settings like light metering, those are things that you're able to adjust on the program auto. So it still shoots automatically, you don't have to do much, but if there's certain settings you want to fix, you can do it through program auto. Aperture priority, shutter priority, and then full manual, which is combining the two, aperture and shutter, are really what we're going to be focusing on today. Those are I would say, a big portion of how the camera functions. If you were to buy a film camera, your ISO is going to be written on the film. So it could say Kodak 400, Kodak 100. That is the sensitivity towards light that your film has, that digital cameras now allow you to change at any time. But things like aperture, your background to foreground relationship, and then shutter, the speed at which you're closing and getting that photo, those are things that are controlled through the physical camera body or the lens. And that's been around since we've had film and since we were shooting on film. So they've really just taken those processes and moved them over into a digital format to make it very similar to what we've already experienced with film, but then also a little bit more advanced because of how it can function in the digital body. The exposure triangle is one of the most commonly used charts in all of photography. What it basically shows is the aperture and how aperture is affected by switching the numbers. It shows shutter and how faster or slower you can be going and what that equates to. And then it shows ISO, which in certain ways shows kind of what you're supposed to be looking at, but breaks it down a little bit differently. And we're going to break down all three of these separately and then talk about how they all come together in the very end. So, without further ado, let's start with aperture priority. So aperture priority, a lot of people can equate this to how much light the camera is letting in. And while that is true because you are opening the iris of the camera up, it's also not as important because we can change our light sensitivity via ISO. We can also change it via exposure. So the thought that aperture is how we're letting light into the camera isn't always necessarily the most important function of it. Really where aperture is so important is that it's our relationship between our background and our foreground when we're taking photos. So when you think about it, if you're taking a picture of, let's say, your kids in front of the pyramids in Egypt, and you want to get the pyramids in the shot, you want them to look good, you want to make sure that you're focusing on both the pyramids and your kids, even though there's a background and foreground relationship with them. The pyramids are most likely in the background, your kids are most likely in the foreground. In other circumstances, we might not want that. Let's say that you're at the playground or at the park and you've got all these other people behind your kids and you just want to get a clean picture of them as they swing on the swings. You might, in a sense, take the aperture and make it really low so you blur out the background. By doing that, you're focusing on your subject matter and you're getting rid of the background around there. That is, in a sense, what aperture represents. So in this case, when we look at this chart, the higher the number is, first off, the smaller the circle is on the inside. So the less amount of light, if you will, or the smaller our view hole is on the physical camera. From there, though, we're able to see both the background and the foreground in perfect clarity. Again, reasons we want to do something like that is if we really care about getting the background in our shot. Is the background going to make or break what we're trying to capture? If you're doing things like vacation photography or possibly group or maybe more candid event photos, background probably is going to be important. If you're doing things like portraits or maybe food photography or nature photography, blurring the background out might be more beneficial because you don't need the extra stuff there. When we're buying lenses or looking at lenses, all lenses can go up to about 22. Some lenses, if I'm not mistaken, go all the way up to 32 as well, but 22 is typically one of the higher f-stops that you'll see. Where more expensive lenses or where lens shopping gets really tricky or becomes to the user is when we get to these lower numbers, like f1.4. When you're shopping and buying lenses, on the lens itself or on the tag or however they have it associated with the lens or the product, whatever the maximum number is, it's going to be the lowest number that our lens can get to. And the reason we care so much about that is that's going to tell us if we're able to blur the background out, get bokeh, or if we're not able to blur the background out, if we're going to see everything. So we can see at f22, we can see the entirety of the picture. f16 is still looking pretty good. f11, we're starting to blur things out. Now the stuff in the background is starting to get a little more hazy, to the point where f8, f5.6, f4, it's getting lighter and lighter and falling into the background where we no longer can really see it. And by the time we get to f1.4, we can barely make out that there are any pyramids behind our waving subject matter. Looking at some examples for that. On the left, we have our dogs. They got the nose, and we got a dog in the background. We can see the nose in perfect clarity, so this is the foreground of our subject. Now, the thing we can't see clearly is the other dog behind them. Now, we can make out that that's a dog. We can tell by its general shape and all the colors and everything else. It most likely is a lady dog of some sort because it's got a pink collar, but we can't see where the focus of the dog's eyes are going. Are they looking at us? Are they looking straight ahead? They're doing one of the two. It's not necessarily a 1.4 because we can make out that there's a dog behind there, but it's not necessarily an f22 because we can't clearly see the dog. So for this image, I probably would say that it's somewhere between the f4, maybe f8 at the highest, and possibly f6, 5.6 would be a good one for that. Where we're still able to make it out that that's what that is, but we're losing a little bit of the clarity and the finer details because of how blurred out it is. When we move over to our squirrel, on the other hand, we can see the squirrel in perfect clarity. We can see that it's eating something in its hands. But as far as the shrubbery and the greenery behind there, the only reason we can kind of tell is because this is number one, probably some sort of wood or tree branch, And then two, we have little indications from the photo itself that there are some greenery, some grass, some probably evergreen tree right there. But it's blurred out pretty good. So in that case, I probably would say it's closer to f1.4 or f2 because we really lose the background. We can't make out the single branches anymore, and we can't make out the single leaves or evergreen pieces that are there. However, we know that that's probably the case because we have a couple hints from the other photo that show us that. Now, other reasons we might want to use the aperture priority is for bokeh. Bokeh, or bokeh dots, if you will, is a really cool effect where when you blur out your background, light and other things that are heavily saturated will give out these kind of circle-like colors that just look really cool. It just shows that your background is being so far blurred out or so far not in focus that your main subject matter is the main piece. You'll see a lot of this when people are trying to do maybe best example I would say is I have a lot of friends that do like anime and they'll do cosplay, if you will, and some of them will put different features and sets behind them when they're taking photos if they're not taking it at other like venues or places. And one of the more popular ones that I've seen is blurring out the background so that you get these dots that appear. They give off a really cool effect when you're taking photos. Again, other reasons might just be for, it really would come down to aesthetics. There's really no one good reason why you'd want to do this. There's not a bad reason for why you'd want to, but it's for the look overall that you're going for.
The aperture is like 1.4.
2, probably 1.2, 1.4 in there. 1.8, you probably can get away with it. Once you get to like 2, 4, that's where you're going to not see it as much. The background will be blurred, but you're not going to get those dots back there. You also have to check your light metering source too, depending on how you're metering and measuring light from the camera. If you're doing like a center one or a whole frame, it might have issues, but if you can turn it where it's hitting at the brightest lights that it's finding, that's where you get that really cool effect too. Why do we want to use an aperture priority mode, or why should we even care about aperture in general? And I think an image like this kind of sells that point perfectly. You have this beautiful background with what looks like waterfalls in the background, kind of shore of rocks, and then a beautiful sunset going across this kind of everlasting horizon line. And so without using something like aperture priority, you might focus on the girl who's standing on the rocks barefoot and then blur out the rest of the background. But because the background is so beautiful and it probably adds to this nice nature scene, we want to keep both of them in focus. So aperture priority is great for people who are trying to constantly change the relationship between their background and their foreground. They're not concerned about the shutter speed and they're not concerned about ISO, at least to the point where they're either keeping ISO at automatic or changing and setting the number of ISO to whatever it is that they're trying to do. But aperture priority is a really good mode to use if you're going to be constantly switching between what's in focus, the background, the foreground, all that good stuff.
So if you wanted to do bokeh, you could still do it.
Yeah, through aperture priority, absolutely, yeah. You're either going to do it through manual or aperture. There wouldn't be another one that you'd be able to do that with. To review one more time, so again, like I said, the numbers can sometimes go all the way up to 32. That's typically the highest aperture that you're going to see out there for some lenses. In f32, we can clearly see everything that's going on in this. So we're in some sort of forest preserve. We have a tree bark in the center there, a little bit of water, and then we have a blue garbage can all the way in the background, which looks like it's next to a parking lot. As we continuously blur the background out, by the time we get to f2.8, we only have our tree branch or our tree bark in view, and that background is completely gone. To the point where you probably can tell just based on the colors and the saturation of those colors that it's some sort of nature in the background. But it's blurred out to the point where that blue garbage can almost blends in with whatever the asphalt color is there, and now you really can't see it anymore. So aperture might be a good way too, depending on your framing and where you're at. It's a good way to hide things in the background if our main subject is all of our focus, instead of having to either change or crop things later on in our editor, or if we are, let's say, then shifting ourselves so that way we get the better shot out of there. If you only have one shot to then take and make this kind of image, blurring the background might help eliminate some of the distraction or the points of contention that we don't want to see. Now shutter speed, it's the second part of this. Shutter speed is the speed at which our shutter is opening and closing. So the best way to think about that is that when you take a picture, your shutter is closing at a very fast rate. Typically when we're taking pictures, we're shooting at least, I would say, 1/125th of a second, 1/30th of a second. Those are usually pretty good numbers. 1/60th of a second. Those are your average numbers. They're still going very quickly, but when you think about it, the longer that the shutter is open for, the more movement that can then show, the more blurriness that comes in, the more light that gets let in, and before you know it, there's a lot of things that we're missing when we take that photo. So in this case, we've got someone who's running, and we're taking a picture of them as they're jogging or running, and it's then labeled with the bottom number there. When we look at 1/500th of a second all the way down to 125ths of a second, our running man, or our little stick figure, seems to be in perfect stillness. There's not movement, there's no blurriness, it looks clean. When we get to that 1/60th, 1/30th, and 1/15th of a second, we can see the blurriness that's wrapping around some of our character here, especially at the 1/15th of a second and the 1/30th. We can kind of start to see it on 1/60th of a second, but if that was what you did to get that photo, you'd probably be okay with that look. What's happening here is that the slower that we're going, or the more that we drop that speed down, we're losing the clarity of our runner as they're going past us. The faster we go with the shutter, the more clear and the more of a, let's say, stable image that we're getting. So the reason we control shutter is to make sure that whatever crosses through our path, we're getting in perfect stillness. Some examples of that. First, one of the things that you can think about too is that to freeze action, especially in a high sports or high movement kind of involved area, is to go at least 1/1000th of a second or faster. That's going to ensure that you get a good stoppage on the frame and that you're getting the picture that you want. For example, with our surfer, the water is moving extremely fast, to the point where all of these little particles that are coming up start to look blurry. Even for 1/1000th of a second, it's very, very fast water that's moving as our surfer is jumping or doing whatever tricks that he's doing. So because of that, the camera itself isn't focused on getting the water perfect. It's focused on whatever the subject matter or whatever we're pointing it to is. When we look at the subject matter, he's in perfect stillness, he's in perfect motion. We're not losing anything from that, from using the speed. However, though, we are getting that little bit of blurriness from the water because, again, the water is moving faster than our surfer. But the surfer being our main subject matter, that's the main thing that we're focused on here.
What if you're in a dark, like a theater, and but you have it high like that so that when they're moving, but you need it lower because of the light?
You probably want to play with ISO then and exposure compensation, because those are two ways around it. A lot of the times though, if you've got something that's high movement and you really can't get past changing that shutter speed to make it lower, changing those two dials, that's where that full manual control really gives you everything that you need after that. Exposure will take the whole brightness or darkness of the entirety of the image and raise and lower it. ISO will change its sensitivity, so if it's having a hard time getting that shot because it is so dark, raising that sensitivity up will help it be a little bit more receptive to the smaller lights that are going on. Especially if you have stage lighting where it's only hitting the stage and that's all you have.
And then you can't use a flash. So.
Exactly, yeah. So play with ISO, play with exposure compensation in those types of situations, and you should have a better chance at getting the image. Other reason we like to use shutter is to give a sense of motion. So when we look at this bird here, we can see that its wings are in motion. We can see the movement there. We can also see though that the body of the bird is in complete stillness. The yellow, the green, the brown, the feathers looks really clean. They got a little bug in their beak, so they caught some food. But again, using that speed that we're choosing to use there might still lend itself to give a little bit of blurriness. However though, it's the overall picture that we're more concerned about. And in this case with the hummingbird, overall it looks really good. Creating mood with long exposures is another big one. So in this case, this is a long exposure shot. And what that basically means is that we're keeping the camera open for possibly 5 or 6 seconds, possibly even longer than that. By doing that, we're oversaturating our sensor And by doing that as a whole, we're now going to be getting something more colorful, more bright, more vivid, something with more contrast as well too. And you can see a lot of that, especially in the moss section between the dark greens, light greens, and even the black parts that are kind of tucked into the wall there. When we look at the foliage kind of going around the left side of the waterfall, we can see the different variations of green. The lines and grooves within the rock are really clear. The waterfall itself looks really beautiful. However, similar to how we had that surfing picture where the water had that blurriness to it because it's very fast and it's unpredictable, same thing that we're getting with this. So water is one of those kind of photographed features or items where when you take a picture of it, you sometimes will get that blurriness no matter what, especially if it's moving. However, you can play with that to your advantage as the photographer because it just looks really cool. Another example, a long exposure on this one. When we look at a photo like this, we've got our guy standing in front of the subway train. As the train goes by, we can see the lights zooming by. However, our roof is in perfect stillness and is nice and saturated. This gentleman in his red jacket are very oversaturated. And same thing with the bikes. The color pops really nicely. However, we still have that moving piece that is the train in the background. Why do we want to use shutter priority? And I think this is a great example of why we would want to use one. You get these events or environments where you're taking pictures and there's a lot of movement or activity, and therefore we need to make sure that we're setting our camera so that way we can take pictures at great speed. So things like shutter or full manual with when we're controlling shutter really help in the long run of making sure that we get a clean image every single time, especially when there's movement. Another nice example of that, we have a gentleman doing a trick on a motorbike of some sort. They're in the air, probably 100 feet off the ground, and someone's all the way back with their camera trying to get this image. They're not going to get this by doing a 1 in 500th of a second or 1 in 125th of a second. They're going to get this by making sure that they have their speed turned up to at least 1 in 1,000, possibly 1 in 2,000, if that's not fast enough. Because again, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So you want to make sure you're setting those things properly in order to get what you want. This is where we get past that basic camera beginner's class, because in something like that, while you can, of course, go right to shutter and change it so you get the image, if you can't understand how the automatic on your camera works and then you jump into full manual or aperture or shutter priority, you possibly are losing out on the nuances that it takes to really understand what's happening here. So practice on automatic no matter what, but once you feel more comfortable with that, try shutter, try aperture priority, give those a shot to see what you like before moving on to full manual. The last part of that full manual control is our ISO. ISO changes the sensitivity of our frame, of our sensor. The more sensitive our sensor is, the more light we're intaking. The less sensitive we are, the less light that we're taking in. Where we really see things like that are with examples like I have up here. So at ISO 100, we're pretty dark for the most part. We're not seeing a lot of the water or the contrast. It's just kind of muted. The 200 ISO, we're seeing more light. Things are starting to get a little bit brighter, especially under the bridge and some of the shoreline there. But it's not until we get to the 400 and 800 where we really open up and see all that color and variation within that color too. So it's important to keep that in mind, that even if we have our camera set to automatic ISO, or we're using, let's say, Aperture 400 or 500 because that's what our friends told us to do, while that's great, still the only true way to have full manual control over your camera is to make sure that you're setting and using ISO properly. ISO, however, equates to noise. And noise is basically going to be the graininess or, let's say, pixelization of your photo. In this case, we have I want to say Chrysler building. It's either the Chrysler or the, my mind now. Empire State Building. It's one of the two. Either way, I can't think of which one it is. There's enough light that's going on in this image that we really don't need to turn the ISO up that high. So at ISO 100, we can see that the building itself is in clarity, we can see the detail on it, the lighting, the lights that are physically turned on. When we get to ISO 3200, we have the same building, same exact everything. The only difference in this case is that it's grainy, and we can see this texture that almost looks like white snow all around the image. While that might not necessarily be the biggest problem in the world for some, it might lend itself to be a little difficult for others because it just doesn't look proper. Some people like the graininess on their photo. It reminds them of film or of other things they may have seen. But for the majority of people, when you're taking a photo, we don't want noise to be on the physical photo. We want to get it as clean as possible. So you start taking pictures, and I always recommend after you take a couple shots, zoom into the photos, see the quality of the image, make sure you like it before you continue taking if you need to redo or do something different. However, keep in mind, where was I going with that?
Can you edit that out in Adobe?
Yes and no. It's a little difficult to edit out of there. I've only done it once myself, but typically if you're getting a lot of that noise on the physical image, you're not going to be able to get that off. So that's just, you've oversensitized or made your sensor oversensitive, and so it's basically overcompensating for itself when that light is hitting it. So if you start to notice it right off the bat, try to turn your ISO down. And if you're running on auto ISO, which is one of my personal recommendations on there, the camera should be able to read that light sensitivity and adjust for you accordingly. But again, higher we turn that ISO when we don't need it, the more sensitive our image is going to be and the more noise we're going to get. If we have a lot of light that's coming through, or even just a little bit, we should be keeping our ISO a little bit lower and then experimenting from there. Auto ISO, when to use it. One of my favorite examples that I have was I had a mother come in about a year and a half ago, and she was like, my kids are doing their prom photos, I'm taking it for the parents, what do you recommend I do for my ISO? It is important. And I was like, you should leave it in auto. And the reason I told her to do that is because she was going to be going from things like indoor settings to outdoor settings. They were going to take pictures when they actually got to the venue. They had pre-photo stuff. And then she was just taking candid shots kind of throughout the whole thing. With that being said, she's going to be bumping around and changing her places, and the light is going to change too as she progresses through. So setting it to automatic ISO and letting the camera do the choosing for her saved her in the long run. It's less things that she has to control, less things she has to worry about. She's really just focused on getting the clean picture. It's changing either aperture priority or shutter priority if she needs to. But the camera itself can self-regulate and make sure that it has the proper exposure toward light.
Does it matter like what lens you use?
Nope. The ISO is built into the physical camera. So to review again, as we go through, in the f-stop category, so apertures, we have our pigs on the very top. They're sitting on a couch of some sort. We can make out a table in the background, chairs, the couch. That's f16. As we keep getting lower and lower and lower, by the time we get to f1.4, the background itself is pretty blurred out. We're not able to see much of what we saw earlier. And now we're getting this nice effect where we're separating the background from the foreground and mainly focusing in on our foreground. Our shutter speed works in a very similar way. So just as you were saying, when you go with sometimes faster shutter speeds, it looks a little bit darker. However, though, when we do that, if we can play with the ISO and switch that around, we should have a better time than getting the adjustment working with that, either ISO or exposure comp. Now, in this case, at 1/1000th of a second, we can see the hammer clearly going down to strike the nail. As soon as we get to 1/250th of a second, we start to lose that. It's blurry. And then by the time we get down to half a second, it's almost unrecognizable what is actually happening here. You can notice that the piece of wood that's in there never changes because it's not moving. So it doesn't matter what we set the shutter speed for those. Now, when we look at the coin on the bottom, we can see the ISO levels kind of labeled out. At ISO 100, we can clearly see the texture of the wood and the penny itself. It's all very dark, if you will, and you can see the clear difference between the two. As we start to go up in the numbers, we're starting to lose a lot of that clarity. to the point where when we get to 2500, we can see the heavy pixelation on there, heavy pixelation on the coin, and we have this nice big graininess that's kind of going on there. So again, ISO is great, set it accordingly, but be careful when you're using it, because the higher you have it and the more sensitive of an area, the less that you're going to be able to get a clean image. So with that being said, this is the exposure triangle, and they all come together when you're ready to set those up. And that's what we're going to look at next. We're going to take some images, we're going to break them down, and we're going to talk about what we're seeing here based on those parameters, if you will. Now, I mentioned this a couple times, but exposure meter, exposure compensation, it's a very important thing to know about a camera. When you go +1, +2 a number, or +1 or -1, -2, the +1, +2 category is making your image more susceptible or making it more exposed all across. Whereas when we lower it, it is lowering those. So let's say you take a shoot in the mid-afternoon, it's nice outside, but it's still chilly, you got a little bit of snow, it's dark, you've got some street lights that you're using when you photograph. The -1, -2 might be enough where if you're getting too much light that's coming in and you want to make it darker, you move it that direction and it'll help you do that. If it's still too dark and we want to go back to making it look somewhat normal, and we've already changed all our settings in our camera, we can look at the +1, +2 category and do something similar. Now, each brand is going to do it a little bit differently. Just looking on the very bottom there, you can see that's how Nikon sets theirs up. The very top one is how Canon sets theirs up. So again, very similar for the most part, but everybody does it a little different. Now, full manual is control over both the aperture and shutter speeds of the camera, as well as ISO. Again, ISO can be something that you're doing automatic, and technically you can just change to an aperture or shutter priority and let the camera do the rest. You just focus on the shuttering or the physical sensor of the camera. However, though, full manual is the technical way that anybody who grew up with a film camera would have learned, anybody who has shot with a film camera can understand to a certain degree. That control over the aperture and the shutter has been going on for at least 100 years when cameras first started coming out. So this is the part of the class that I mentioned earlier. I'm going to break down some images and see what I see, and then I'm going to explain where I'm getting these numbers from. So the first thing, I've got this view going down a nice long wooden bridge, possibly somewhere in Germany or in Turkey. With this image, though, we can see that the clear as day that we have a horizon line right there in the background with concentric lines coming this direction towards us. From there, we can see that the building is clearly lit. We can see that there are a few different dark spots on there. The first thing that I notice is in the top right corner of this picture is the graininess inside the bar. So that's going to lead me to believe that the ISO was turned a little bit too high in order to get this, or it was turned, it wouldn't have been turned too low, too high would have been the number. In this case, it was turned a little too high, and that's the other reason why we're getting such bright lights coming from some of these rooms where they could be muddled down a little bit more. It's because it was exposed for too long. Aperture, it's pretty wide open. You can see all the way down there, so I'm going to say it's closer to f22, maybe f18. And then shutter speed, because this isn't a moving object, probably doesn't need a lot of speed on there. So 1/125th of a second, 1/200th of a second, I think that'd be more than enough. Here we have some cherry blossoms. We can see that our first cherry blossom is in nice full focus. It's got a little guy on the side there that also looks really nice. When we're taking a picture like this, the background is blurred out a good amount. However, because of the extra pink and everything else in the background with the sticks, we can kind of make out that that is going to be more of this cherry blossom. In that case then, what we're looking at is to possibly blur that background out to make the main focus the cherry blossom. So we're probably looking at more like a 5.6 to 8, I would say, where we can clearly see the background for what it's worth, but however, we're not necessarily getting the full context of all of that. with that, I'd say lighting is really good. So ISO doesn't need to be too high on there. It's probably like maybe 100, 200. You got good sunlight coming in, natural sunlight. And then as far as shutter, unless we've got a really aggressive wind that's blowing these branches back and forth, we probably have a slower shutter speed. Again, like a 1 and 125ths of a second, or maybe 1 and 250th of a second. Nothing too fast, but nothing too slow. And the reason I don't think it's too slow is because I don't see a lot of saturation. These pinks could be brighter, if you will, and could be a little bit darker. And because of that, I would then maybe believe that it would be like a long exposure or long saturation. Here we've got some firemen lined up. They're walking through. This could be a dramatic photo. This could be some guys going to work. But in the case of this one, we've got good focus on the front fireman and less focus on the back fireman. In this case, I probably would put this one closer to f2, maybe 1.8, because we can clearly make out the foreground. The background we can tell is the fireman. However, it's blurred out enough that we can't see where his focus is. We can't really clearly make out who he is, if we knew him or not. But again, we know that it's another fireman just based on the outline and what they look like. Let's see, aperture on, that was aperture. ISO on this one, it's not very dark on the image. There's not a lot of light that's coming through, but I probably would put this maybe at a 200 or 300 ISO, 100 being the lowest. The only reason I don't think it's a 100 is because there's not a lot of light going, but there's enough light that we can make everything out. You've got some shadows coming down. They're a little harsh in certain areas, like underneath his hat, or along the collar there. So again, and I'm not seeing any graininess or pixelization, so again, I don't think it's that. As far as shutter speed goes, there's a couple things that come to my mind. If this image was taken as a still photo, then they're probably not moving, so shutter is probably going to be in that same ballpark of 1/125th or 1/250. If they're walking towards the camera, maybe 1 300ths of a second, maybe 1/500ths of a second. Depends on how fast that walking speed would be.
How would you, like, if someone went in and edited the photo, would you still be able to look at it and tell it's done?
That part, yes, because for the most part, even if you edit and you change the saturation, the sharpness, that kind of stuff, you're not going to be able to change that background blur. You're not going to be able to change that one. The lighting and the saturation of the lighting, it's something that you'll be able to change maybe the color or the way that we're viewing it, but you're not going to be able to change that significantly enough where I'm going to be able to tell. Or not be able to tell. And same thing with shutter speed too. Even if you edit and change the stuff, we're looking for that crispness and we're looking for movement. When we see movement on an image, it's very clear. When we don't see a lot of movement, when things look still or stagnant, we can usually pick up on those signals depending on how long you've been looking at this stuff for. Like for example, on some of the next ones, not this one, but I think this is the following one after this. To break this one down though, and I think I've said this in similar ones, I believe this is at like some sort of national like field museum or history museum, because for the first part, if this animal saw you, it would try to headbutt you really, really bad. But on the flip side, the closeness and the detail that we have from there just feels very, not artificial, but just feels not real, if you will. So first and foremost, f-stop, the background slightly is blurred out, probably a 5.6 or an 8, because we can clearly make out that that's a tree, some snow on the ground, and sticks and shrubbery. However, it's not clearly in focus like an f22 or f18 might be. The color of this is really nice, and the lighting looks like it's also pretty good, but it also looks like it's like more of an iridescent or like a white LED lighting. So I probably would put this closer to like 200, 300 for ISO. And as far as the shutter speed, and this is what I always kind of am confused on this one, if this thing is moving, then we're probably using a fast shutter speed. But given the saturation and the color and how things look on this, how they all pop, I probably would say this is a slower shutter speed. Maybe something of like 1 500ths of a second, maybe the next step up, not 1 1,000ths of a second, because we don't really have, or sorry, I'm saying slower shutter speed. It's probably closer to like 1 1/25th of a second or 1/60th of a second. We're being a little slower with this one, but as long as we're not shaking with it, or in taking more detail that we're getting out of the subject. But to kind of do the flip side of that with editing, is very well could be edited. And the reason I say that is because we have really nice color and saturation going through this. That could have been strengthened or sharpened. Same thing with the yellow underneath the eye there. It pops out off of it a little bit more. So not to say that someone couldn't have edited this photo and changed things on there, but it still wouldn't make or break kind of the foundation to how they would have taken the photo. Same thing, and I believe, same thing on something like this. When we talk about motion and seeing motion, just like the surfer, just like our guy doing the motocross trick, this is another place where we're seeing motion. Reason being is we can clearly see that they're airborne for the first part, and understanding both frisbees and how dogs play catch, we can imagine that someone threw, the dog then retrieved, hopped in the air, and cat caught it. So this is going to require fast speed. So this is going to be more of a 1 in 1,000th or 1 in 2,000th of a second that we're taking. The reason being is because we're trying to get it in the fastest kind of pace that we can without losing the detail. As far as background blur, for the one on the left of our black and brown dog here with the white frisbee, the background to me appears to be some cars, and I can kind of see the shine coming off of them. That's what's leading me to believe that. But because we've blurred that background out so much, I can't really tell you much more about that. How many cars are there, what color the cars are, etc. However, with that background blur, I'm probably looking at an f-stop of about 1.4, maybe 1.8. I don't think 1.2 because you can really still kind of tell a little bit. However, when we look at the dog on the right, our brown and white dog there with an orange frisbee, we can see that the background is blurred, but not enough that we can't tell that that's some sort of tree shrubbery with some bushes there, and then more trees kind of sprawling in the background. So that could be closer to a 5.6 or an 8. We're still blurring the background out enough that we're getting the haziness of it, but we're still getting that kind of nice stillness on that product there too, or on the greenery, I should say, that product. However, when we look at ISO on both of these, they're probably going to be low, 100 ISO. And the reason I'd say that is because you have nice sunlight coming from the top of the animal, so it's definitely going to be positioned at least somewhere around here, because we have a nice little drop shadow that hits there. Same thing for this one. Shadow is going to be probably in the top right corner, and we've got that shadow coming down, possibly maybe more above, hitting down. Aperture, shutter, ISO. Yeah. So again, we're seeing good keys of movement here. Using something with a faster shutter speed is really going to help us capture that moment in nice, perfect stillness.
What would you say the shutter speed was?
1 in 1,000 or 1 in 2,000. Again, when we look at stuff like that surfer guy that we looked at, and then that other image of the motocross guy, you're moving at such a great speed. I can only imagine how fast the dogs are moving in this one. There's two things that are probably happening here. One of them being that faster shutter speed, but then two being that burst mode, where you're changing your drive mode from being a single photo to that. That's really going to help, because even if you have a fast shutter speed and whatnot on there, if you take one photo, the chances of that one photo being perfect, whereas taking 15, 20 photos in a second, one of those has to look perfect.
And when you say, like, I was always told, if you're taking a picture outside in the day and there's sun, your ISO is probably going to be around 100, 200.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's what I would say for the same thing for this one. If you've got beautiful natural sunlight, you don't need to have such a sensitive sensor. And the reason being is like things like the white on the fur or even the white on the frisbee are going to become really, really bright and really colorful, and we're going to lose some of the detail, especially when you look at something where it's like the deep different colors that are going through, or that mix between the colors, or the dog's eyes. Those are the things that we want in the image because it makes it look really nice, or it pops a little bit. And if we change the saturation and make it too high, we'll lose things like that. We can always correct that later on in Photoshop or Lightroom, but as a photographer, when you're taking the first photos, the idea in there shouldn't be, I can fix this in post. The idea should be getting it in one clean go and then making it or improving it in post. And I think this is one of the last ones that we have before we talk more about lenses. In this picture, you've got someone diving into the end zone. So they're about to slide onto the turf. In this case, we can see that clearly our background is more football players. However, they are slightly blurred to the point where you can't really see anything on his helmet there. Probably says whatever team that they play for. Same thing with up there. You can see the number slightly. It could be a 6, that could be an 8, that could be maybe a 6 and next to another number as well too. There's really no way of making that out. There's also lettering on his football pants, and you can't see that either. What we do get to see though is that our football player is clearly diving into the end zone, probably slipped a couple tackles. They're moving at a great speed, and as they're jumping in, they're kicking up all of the rubber bits that are usually on turf. So in this case, you're probably also looking at about a 1 in 1,000 speed because they're diving into the end zone, they're running. You can only imagine how fast a football player runs down the field, maybe even faster than that, 1/2000th of a second. ISO is probably going to be low again too, around 100, because you've got all this light through the football field, and you've got some form of light that's coming from the top, and that's why we're getting these dramatic shadows in all of the different areas that our players or opponents are in. And then as far as aperture goes, I know I mentioned that they were blurred, but I probably would give them like an f8, maybe an f6, because you can still make out that they're the football players, but you can't necessarily make out the finer details of them. This is the last one, I believe. So this one got me for a long time. I kept trying to figure out what was really going on here. This is a long exposure photo, and its ISO is too sensitive. This would be an example of when you change your settings and you make them a little too high. This is the kind of stuff that you're getting. So the reason I say ISO is too high on this photo is because you have these really elaborate spiky balls of light that are coming from what's most likely street lamps that are lighting up what seems to be a train station. And I'll explain that part next. But these lights are overly saturated, they're overly bright, and there are some little bits of pixelation that's going on in the sky in the background, which would lead me to believe that my ISO is too high, probably something closer to like 800 or maybe 1000 ISO. So we're making our camera very sensitive, and when those lights then hit the camera, we're losing a lot of the detail that would normally be there. From there too, we also have a moving image of some sort because we have these red lines that are going across on the very bottom. Those are the same types of lines that we saw when we looked at the long exposure and we had that train going by. These are either taillights from a car or they're taillights from a train of some sort as it passes by. The bike in itself is in perfect detail, it looks really nice and clean. However, we have movement going in the back of the back area there too. So long exposure could have been 15 seconds, could have been 10 seconds, could have been 5 seconds as long for that. The photo itself is pretty still, there's no movement going on anywhere else. So they definitely either had it on a tripod or put it on a bench or put it on the floor and then took this picture. And as far as aperture goes, we can clearly make everything out in the background. There's really no distortion to that. If the lowest, I would say, might be an f16, at the highest, f32, f22, those sorts of numbers. Again, learning your camera is only the start. Anyone can learn to use a camera. You have to practice with it. You have to go. If you're going on vacation or I always make the joke, if you go to the grocery store, bring your camera with you, take pictures, like just practice doing it in weird environments that you normally wouldn't. Sometimes that's the best way to learn how to use your camera because you're putting yourself more to the test. If you're an animal photographer, maybe take pictures of humans. If you only bought it to take pictures of the kids during holidays or their sports, maybe practice in the backyard taking it of flowers or of bugs or anything to get more familiar with how the functions work on that guy. My best camera accessories I think anybody can get, practice with it. If you're, again, doing anything, just take pictures. Keep taking classes on there. I know I'm one outlet and I kind of just teach the bare bones of what you should be looking at with this, but there are places like with Oakton Community College or even in the city, some of the other ones, they have adult continuing learning programs where you don't get any credit for taking the class, but you can really learn some amazing tips and tricks on how this thing functions and how to use it better. YouTube, I think, is one of the best resources out there if you're properly using it. If you type in your camera model that you have and type in 10 things you didn't know about XYZ camera, you will find 1,000 videos by camera nerds nerdier than myself that will go through every little nook and cranny of the camera, every little detail. You'll be exhausted by the time they're done. Workshops are great too. There's 2 that come in constantly here. I haven't seen them in a while, but Botanical Gardens in Chicago, or in the suburbs over here, have a club where they all workshop together to take photos of different parts of the conservatory at the Botanic Gardens. They then have like a gallery where they compete against each other to who's got the better photo. Whoever wins then has theirs as the cover of whatever their magazine is, whatever the newsletter that goes out to those who sponsor that. And then there's another club, it's the O'Hare Shooting Club, where they have very specific permission to go out onto this one section of the tarmac, and they can take pictures of the planes landing and taking off. They have special clearance, everything. They've got really big lenses and all this really cool stuff, but they workshop together, they talk, they hang out, and they get to take pictures of planes, which they really enjoy doing. So there's birding groups too, all sorts of stuff that you can really get into to get better. And then travel. If you're going somewhere and you don't bring your camera with you, then I think that's a shame on you. You should always have it with you. I know it's bulky and sometimes it's too big and you don't want to have something so valuable with you, but those cool photos that you're going to get, or those expert kind of shots that you'll take of wherever you're at, you're not going to get that on an iPhone or a Samsung phone. You're going to get that from a real camera, which is awesome. Other accessories, and I know I've done this before in all my classes, but I'll do it again. I think that the top 4 are probably your most important items to have. Have a bag so you can store everything properly. Have an extra battery, have an extra memory card. If your battery goes out, it's always good to have a backup in case you forgot to charge, or maybe it just died on you, or maybe it's a bad battery, so you have a backup for that. Memory cards, same idea. They can go bad after a period of time, and once they do, if you're out and about getting ready to take photos, most to all cameras have no internal storage, so you need a memory card of some sort. Lens cleaning kit, you get dust, mud, water, dirt on there, anything, you can easily clean it off with a kit, even if it's just a nice microfiber cloth. With that being said, do not use your sweaters or your t-shirts. The wool or cotton or certain fabrics will have like little micro, not plastics, but will have micro kind of debris on there, and they can sometimes damage your lenses, especially if you don't have filters on there. And a strap. I think straps are really important. Keep it around your neck, have it supported. Get ones that are padded, or get ones with like spring tension on there so it doesn't hurt when you're using it. Tripods are great if you think you need one, great for stabilization. External hard drives are a great option because, again, if you either don't have enough storage on your computer, or you're someone like me and you want to make sure that your photos don't just live on the computer, they are in multiple sources so you don't lose them, external hard drives are the way to go. Polarizing filter, ND filter, those are great as well too. Those will help protect the lens, but then they'll also help reduce the amount of kind of negative or non-positive light that we have coming through. Those could be as simple as glare, that could be something as simple as like a bad shine, or sometimes when we take pictures you'll get those kind of like rings that come up from something. A lot of the times that could be minimized with a filter of some sort. And then additional lenses, which we'll talk about next. Date your body, mirror your glass. That's kind of the age-old saying in the camera world. Your camera body is going to get slow. It's going to die on you eventually. You got about 10 good years with your camera body, and then it's going to kick the bucket. You'll notice it gets slower, the technology's outdated, it's not firing as well as it should, it's not holding a charge anymore. There might be a plethora of different issues on there. Very similar to your cell phone. You only get your cell phone for about 5-6 years before something happens where it slows down, you run out of memory, doesn't turn on and off anymore, the screen looks busted up, there's burn-in, all sorts of stuff. But the glass, those lenses that you're spending either as much of your camera on or more than what your camera body costs, those are going to be the things that you're going to carry on with you even if you move to a different brand or something else. They make adapters and converters to move that over. So if you're going to invest in something and you're concerned, if you cheap out on the body and you get something a little bit cheaper, I definitely would recommend going for a higher quality glass. You won't regret it. It'll last you forever, and if you take proper care of it, it should even resell really well too if you ever decide that this isn't for you anymore. First thing we'll talk about before we really break down lenses is focal length and zoom. Focal length and zoom basically equate to the same thing. There were scientists and people years and years and years ago that discovered or figured out that this is how they were going to make the terminology of the lenses. That millimeter size has nothing to do with the size of your lens. A lot of people think, oh, it's 70 millimeters in length. It's not true. It's the viewing distance, and there's a few other parts of that equation that then go in to determine if that's a 70, that's a 105, that's a 200, and a 400. But the way that we can look at this is that the focal length as we zoom in, and it's important to remember this too, it's not just zooming in the main subject that we're taking pictures of. It's bringing everything closer to us. So when we look at something like 70 millimeters, we can see the mountains in the distance of the picture. We can see the greenery and possibly what looks to be like a little town or city over there. And we can see their main seagulls kind of in this swampy area. We move to 105, those mountains and those buildings and that greenery got a lot closer to us off that one image. The birds are still getting closer, but everything around it is getting closer. Then we get up to something like the 200, and now those mountains are in full kind of view. The buildings are in full view, so is the background there, and the birds are even closer. When you get to the 400 millimeter one though, now it feels like it's very exaggerated. Like the birds are close up to us, but now the stuff in the background has gotten even closer. That's technically the distortion of the lens, and that's something that you're going to see no matter what lens that you're using. As you zoom in and as you change things on the foreground front, the background is going to become more amplified. It's going to become even bigger. And that's going to naturally happen as you start zooming in with the lens. So focal length and zoom, they're going to equate to each other, and that's going to be kind of the caveat effect, if you will, of zooming in, is we're bringing that background even closer as we bring our foreground closer. I have this little GIF on the next one, that GIF that kind of explains it all. So when you start at the 200, that background, even though our subject matter hasn't moved, has now come much closer to us. So the subject matter is in the same spot, and that background is even closer up on them. As we then go to the, a lower number, we are then pushing that background further, and we're keeping our subject matter in front of us. That's the compression that we're getting between background and foreground relationship as we change that number. The other thing that's happening here is the face. As we go for that wider number, we're getting the face much more rounder, more plump, if you will. It looks like it's adding a couple pounds onto it. As we make that number smaller though, we're then bringing that nose more forward, and we're getting more of like a bottleneck look, where we are making the features much smaller and tighter. However, the background and the foreground are still having that kind of relationship with each other as it goes. So this guy's not moving at all. The only thing that's changing is the lens.
So that's why you want portrait lens when you're doing.
Exactly. It's one of those things that it's not to say that like a 24 to 70 or 18 to 45, like some of the stuff you'll see in the kit lenses are a bad thing, but it's the fact that as we change that number, we're getting the compression from the background to that foreground, and it's going to distort the image slightly. When we have a portrait prime lens, like a 50, 35, 75, 85, those are built to make sure that they don't bring the background up as much, and we're getting a more true to life photo. Depending on what you're trying to do, it can make or break what you're after. People that are birders or are, animal photography, wildlife photography, even if I get the mom who does like sports all the time and she's like, I want to get a picture of my kids while they're on the field. Well, you're going to need zoom unless you're up close and personal. If you're sitting in the bleachers trying to get pictures of your kids, you're going to have to zoom in. It's going to compress a little bit. That's why you have those lenses. But again, if they're lining up to take their prom photos and they're in front of a beautiful fountain, you probably don't want to bring that big bad lens with you. You probably want a prime lens, a smaller lens to get there. Now, I talked a few different terms there of prime lens, telephoto lens, zoom lens. Now we're going to talk about those common lenses, and then I'll tell at the very end kind of what you need. So common lenses that you're going to see nowadays is your kit lens. Your kit lens is usually dictated by a couple different things. One, and probably the most important, is that this is what comes with whatever first camera you buy. Typically people come in, they're not as well versed in cameras, they're getting just started, and they want a kit lens. It's the best way and most economical way to get started taking photos, where if you buy a really nice fancy camera body, you get a kit lens with that, or get the kit that it comes with, so that way you're able to just start taking photos immediately. What you're getting usually with a kit lens is a small, short telephoto lens. And that's going to be something like this, where it's an 18 to 55. It's not necessarily the longest distance one, but from 18, that's going to be our wide angle. You can get interior shots, landscape. You can get, very wide angle portrait pictures. When we move to 55 though, and as we start zooming up, we're now getting more of a portrait feel for it. So again, if we have someone who's standing in front of the Christmas tree this holiday season, and we want to get a clean photo of them, that 55 area is probably going to be a really good area to get a nice clean shot of them. Now the next thing to look at with this is that we have these numbers on the side here that say 3.5 to 5.6. Those numbers are referring to its maximum aperture. So in the first beginning of this, when we were breaking down aperture and shutter priority and the difference between, and then how they all work together, is that with an 18 to 50, or with this lens, the lowest number you can start at is 3.5, meaning that that 1.4, 2.8, 2 we were just talking about does not exist on this lens because it can't give us that number. The glass is either not the best quality or it's just not built to do that. Typically, kit lenses are like this because they won't give you the most high quality lens they have for such a discounted price. On the flip side of that though, as we zoom and we get closer to that 55mm number, we are now getting closer to the 5.6 aperture. So we're getting a much, let's say, not as good or not as background blurring aperture when we zoom on this lens. So it starts at 3.5, but as we turn that lens to get to the 55mm from 18, it's going to jump up to 5.6. That's natural with a lens like this. That's because it's a kit lens. Is it your forever lens? Probably not. But for someone who's just starting, this is a perfect lens to have, and it's not a bad lens to have in your collection. Nifty 50 or prime lens. So Nifty 50 gets its name because people think that it's really nifty or neat. The thing I like about the 50mm is that it's a perfect portrait lens. Our human eye naturally looks and has a view of 50mm. So that is kind of the relationship between our background, foreground, our compression, and then exactly that kind of parameter at which we're seeing. That's what the 50mm is supposed to mimic. That is probably going to be one of your better portrait lenses. That's going to be one of your better just overall lenses because there's no zoom with it, so it can have some of the lower apertures. For example, this one is a 1.4 aperture lens, meaning that you can get 1.4 on here, whereas the other ones you couldn't, and you can go all the way up to 22 as well still. Same idea with the other lens too, and I should have mentioned that. The kit lens, just because that starts at 3.5 to 5.6 as your opening number, doesn't mean you can't raise that all the way up to 22 or 32 respectively. It just means that the maximum or the lowest that you can go on this is 3.5, 5.6. For someone, again, who is not concerned about that background blur and they just want a nice lens to get started, this is more than enough. For the person who wants to take portraits and isn't really looking to zoom and they want to get some of the highest quality images and background blur that they can, a Nifty 50 or a prime lens is perfect for that. Now, this isn't a 50mm. This is what you would call a prime. So a prime is basically anything that is a single number. There's no zoom, there's no telephoto aspect to it. So a 35mm, a 14mm, a 100mm, an 85, a 75. I've even seen the elusive 90mm on some cases. There are lenses that have one single number, no zoom, no nothing. Those are prime lenses. So that's what we refer to as a prime. Typically, prime lenses also will have the highest maximum aperture you can do. 1.2, that's around roughly the highest one I've seen, but you can get 1.4, 1.8, 2, 4. They're going to have sort of stuff like that.
The lower the number, the more it costs.
Yes. The lower the number typically means three things I would say. One, you get obviously that better background blur, but then two, typically you're going to get a much wider circumference of a lens, because one of the things that they do with it is that in order to get that really nice background blur, they have to make the glass wider. So by doing that, it naturally makes it heavier. So you're going to see a wider, heavier, and bigger lens on top of it also being much more expensive. More glass components are going on the inside of it, more layering of glass, and then on top of that too, most lenses have nitrogen kind of pushed onto the inside of it, so there's nitrogen gas on the inside of your lens. That's to help that kind of slide on there, but that's also to help the different coating and the different methods they do for that, so you get a really sharp lens. That's why when you have a camera or a lens, if you drop it, sometimes people will hear like a pop. And it's not the fact that glass broke on the inside, it's the fact that you might have cracked something and allowed that nitrogen to escape. Really is important on the inside of your lens, so you will see that. Now we move over to our zoom or telephoto. Zoom and telephoto are the same thing, but we like saying telephoto because it's telescopic like a telescope. When we change these numbers, typically we're going to have lenses that have higher numbers on this, and where a prime only had 1, these have 2. So 24 to 70, one of my personal favorite lenses, wide angle, portrait, it's good for both. Lens on the other side, you got a 70 to 200. That's your zoom lens. That's for the one where you've got the bird in the distance and you want to get that shot. This is going to be one of the better ones for that. With either of these lenses, when you have a prime or a telephoto lens or zoom lens, the maximum aperture that you can get is 2.8. For whatever reason, the people who make these, the scientists, the engineers who build these things, they don't really have a way of getting past 2.8. That's usually the lowest or highest maximum aperture that you can have for this camera or lens. However, though, you can get ones where they're f4, where they're just what we were looking at with the kit lens, 3.5 to 5.6. All of that is still there. But 2.8 is typically for the most, I'd say the best lenses out there, the ones that cost the most, the ones that perform the best. That 2.8 would be the lowest that you'll find, or highest, I should say, that you'll find. Reasons you'd want to get one of these would be, again, birding. It would be for finding things in the distance. It would be for travel if you're going someplace and you need a lens that can kind of fit itself into multiple things. That's a good way to look at it. It's for the people who do sports photography. It's for the people who are going to be on a cruise and they have to look past things and get a good shot in the distance. These are the kinds of people that would kind of benefit from a lens like this. Again, prime versus zoom lens. Prime is going to be one single number. The best way I describe it is that with a prime lens, if you want to change the field of view that you have, you got to move yourself in order to get the picture that you want. You can't change anything on the lens. Zoom lens, on the other hand, you can reconfigure it so that way it looks further or looks closer, and you can zoom in to get that shot that you're looking for, so it's more optimized. Last lens I'll talk about before I mention, I think, the lenses that you need, and then that should be it for me today. A travel lens. I don't see these quite as much as I did before, but they're still very popular. Typically a travel lens is going to be a big distance of numbers, but it's going to be very similar to that kit lens where it has a bad aperture of like 3.5 to 5.6. It's the beginning one. But the nice part about this is that this hits 18 to 300 millimeters. So for someone who is, let's say, going on safari, they don't really care too much about, blurring out the background. Their goal is just to not have to switch lenses constantly and change. They might benefit from this lens because it's only one lens they have to carry with them. It's not going to give them the best background blur, but typically with these kinds of lenses, that's not what you're looking to get. You're just looking to get something that gives you everything that you're trying to shoot. What lenses do you need? I put quotations around need because I do think that it's not necessary for everyone. I always recommend starting with the kit lens, and if I get someone who doesn't want to start with the kit lens, I would either recommend one of two things. So the Trinity is what they call this setup, and the way it really works is you have your 50 millimeter, your prime lens. You have a 24 to 70, which is your smaller zoom. And then you have your large zoom, which is usually 70 to 200 or plus. So anywhere around that, it's that big bad lens that just gets distance. Typically, I tell people that 70 to 200 is one that you probably could take out of this, and you really should just focus on having the other two. And I think if you're really just starting and you're like, what do I do to begin? I think a 24 to 70 or something around that comparable number is a great way to get started, because you do have the ability to then get the wide angle of the portrait. However, though, if you're someone who's not interested in any of that, you're really only using this to take pictures of products, or maybe you're a jewelry photographer, or you're a wedding portrait photographer, you do pet portraits, probably a 50 millimeter is more than enough for you too. So again, I say that those are the lenses that you need, but you truly only need whatever lens it is for whatever purpose that you're doing. If you can get a lens that's all around for everything that you're trying to do, great. But if you're, again, only doing portrait, or only doing wildlife, or only doing product photography, get yourself the lens that works best for what your means are. And that's all I have for you guys. So this class always is the longest one that I teach because there's so much jam-packed in there. Advanced cameras will be next week, so definitely come to that one. We'll talk more about the photo editing. We're going to go through things of what to do on your main photo editing softwares. So we'll talk about 10 or 15 different steps that everyone will follow. And then from there we talk a little bit about videography and getting into content creation and what that all entails. And yeah, so same time next week, 5:30 to 7. And if anybody doesn't feel like asking questions online, email or call me. I'm always available. I'm off Tuesday, Wednesdays, and yeah, see everybody next week. Any other questions for me before you take off? You're all good?
No, I have a question.
What you got?
But it's on editing.
Oh, well, go ahead and ask.
So I just had a question. If so I'm shooting in a darker place,
Mm-hmm.
and as I'm editing, if I increase the exposure,
Mm-hmm.
and normally I'm just going at what looks good to me.
Yeah, exactly.
I find that if I increase the exposure, I normally like decrease the highlights because it gets the
It's
picture.
gonna do that.
Is
Yeah.
that what?
It's naturally gonna happen. So it's no matter what, if you're changing the exposure, you're either lightening or darkening your image as a whole, right? And so the areas that have more highlights or have that deeper saturation, they're gonna go down slightly, because as you're increasing the exposure over everything, those highlights now get smaller and smaller.
But I normally decrease.
Decrease the exposure, decrease the highlights?
Highlights when I increase the exposure.
Okay.
I play with them to see
Yeah.
which one. What do you normally do when you're looking?
When I'm looking at a photo, it really depends on how dark the image is for me. I typically, when I shoot brighter in general, because I can make it darker easier in post. In my opinion, it's easier to make a picture darker than it is to make a picture brighter, because that's when then you might start to lose color or white balance or certain things that help the image pop. It turns more like a neutral color when you raise certain things.
See, I just have the hardest time when it's in dark and they're wearing white. And I'm trying to make it not look yellow, but still get the white.
Play with the exposure slightly, but then maybe play with your white balance.
Yeah, I started playing with that a little bit and looking at that, but then it took away from the detail, like it took away from their seeing their faces.
You could also, because then another thing to play with once you've done that stuff is sharpness. Have you done
So I haven't done anything with the sharpness.
Sharpness might help a lot too. It'll help things pop, and it'll help.
So either sharpness or the clarity?
Sharpness.
Sharpness.
Yeah, that's what that setting will be. It should be a little dial that you can then move on
I
there.
probably just never paid attention to the sharpness.
It's one of those things when you're editing that it's like playing the guitar. It's like, when you play, you're gonna hit every string. You're gonna do every chord on there when you're doing the thing. When you're editing something on the computer, like, you're gonna use every single thing. Even if you just sit there and go, I'm gonna just increase the highlights slightly.
Right.
Once you increase those highlights, you've changed so many different things on there that now you have to go through and change it all.
Change it again.
So it's one of those things that editing a good photo, if you're really diligent about it, it should be like a 45-minute process per photo when you really think about it, because you might increase it 0.2, and then all of a sudden that doesn't look right. So you go to the next thing and you increase that 0.2 and make it less.
I just have the hardest times with whites.
Try the white balance, and then if that still looks funky to you, I would then play with the sharpness. That might help, especially if it's detracting from the faces of the images you're doing, and it feels like it's getting more yellow.
That's what I'm running into.
Then maybe less focus on the exposure of it, and more focus on either the white balance, or if exposure and white balance are still what you need to use, then exposure, balance, lower your highlights like you're still doing, so that way it looks better, but then try the sharpness.
Okay. Thank you.
Of course. And worst case scenario too, bring your laptop. Is it a laptop or a desktop that you have?
I have my laptop with me.
I was gonna say one of these days, next week if you want, bring a laptop and then we can look at it. Yeah, have some
Great.
images. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anytime.
Okay.
See you next week. Do you have any questions for me?
No.
How do you feel?
I'm okay.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't look like anybody has any questions online, so I will end this class for today. If anybody does have anything in the future they'd like to ask, by all means chat, call me, text me, whatever's easier for y'all, email me. I always tell people too, if you have pictures that you have questions on, email me those pictures, and then give me a little bit of a synopsis of it, and I probably can get you the answers that you're looking for. Have a great night, everybody. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, and for anybody who needs any help with photos, just reach out anytime. If not, get pictures of the holidays, enjoy your time with family, and I will see you guys